So, because this is going to be primarily logstash based, I like the name stash in the SIEM, right? Now, here's what you need to know. I am some random dude who likes logstash. I am a broken clock. Twice a day, I may get lucky and be right. Usually I'm not. So if you decide to do anything, I'm not responsible for what gets broken. Okay. There we go. So I want to make sure we're all speaking the same language because I do not come from a traditional ops background. I work in higher ed. We have our own ways of referring to things that are typically foreign to people that come from either from government or from highly regulated industries, including the way that we refer to stuff. So I just want to make sure we're all speaking the same language. When I talk about logs, we're going to talk about fields, which are discrete units. Yeah, okay. I want to make sure I didn't misspell discrete there. They're discrete units. They're either an IP, they're a timestamp, they're a port, right? Something that we know what's going on. Tags, a bit of metadata that gets added, typically by a user, just so you know what's going on. Parsing, breaking a log out into fields. Enriching, again, taking some additional data source, adding some metadata. Indexing, who is the Splunk user? Right, okay. So when I use the word index, I'm using it in the sense of a Splunk indexer. I'm using it in the elastic sense of we're indexing. Quick word on log formats. We've talked about it all day yesterday. I'm going to talk about it one more time. In the beginning was BSD syslog, and everything that speaks BSD syslog does not. These are actually taken from production. On top, we have a DHCP log using ISC's DHCPD. Below it, a bind log, right? Again, ISC. If I take one of my techs, right, who goes out and they work on endpoints, and I give them a copy of this log of either one of these, I've got about a 1 in 5 chance that they're going to be able to look at it and know exactly what's going on. If I'm looking at it at 3 a.m., right, and I've been up for 22 hours at that point, how likely am I to make a mistake and misread something in a line where I have both a source IP and a destination IP, and maybe I'm looking at some funky format where they're backwards from what I expect. 3 a.m., that's a problem for me. Key pairs, a little bit better. Who is in a Linux environment? Okay, so this will make sense, lots of sense to maybe 5 of us. Whenever you enable Audit D, you can say, hey, I want you to log every command that happens for these users or these types of users or these network connections. And when you do, it says, oh, you're passing arguments to this command. There's a space in there. I'm going to convert that to hex. We're not going to give you the raw command. That's what that big, long, nasty string is there under CMD. We'll come back to that in a second. Ooh. JSON I love. Again, right, we're getting context. Now we're moving beyond key value and saying, this is my source IP, this is my destination IP. Now, this is much easier for me to read. Who's taken 572? Did it indeed rock? Yes, it did. 572 was my favorite class until 555. So for those of you that are taking 555 later, you're in for a treat. So structured data is cool, right? We get more information about the log entry. Now, instead of just seeing 1.2.3.4, we know if that's a source. We know if it's a destination. When we see 200, well, is that, it took me 200 seconds to get my response? Is it an HTTP code? Right? It's good to have that context. So if we're going to apply that to the idea of raw logging, why not apply that to the idea of SIEM just in general, right? We were talking, Carson was talking earlier about schema on query versus schema on, help me out, what was the, schema on ingest, yes, okay. I call that schema on read versus schema on write, right? Schema on read, it's great, right? Splunk makes a big business out of doing this. You dump everything in, it all gets indexed, it knows about everything. And then when you query the data, then you can say, oh, this is my, here's a template. This is going to be an IP address. This is going to be a port. Cool. Lots of flexibility. Schema on write, the elastic approach. I have this thing coming in. I'm going to cut it up, parse it up. These are IP fields. These are port fields. These are timestamps. Da, 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 da. Now let me jam it in somewhere. I'm partial to schema on write. Because without schema on write, I wouldn't be standing in front of you right now. Ultimately, our goal is to be able to sit down and look at something, type something in, get something back, and have it make sense to us. Doesn't matter if you're doing schema on read, doesn't matter if you're doing schema on write, right? You're going to get, here are my fields, here are my values, right? That's kind of our goal. It does me no good to say, hey, I want to see everything related to 8888. Well, what if I've indexed some random log that says, oh yeah, Google has the DNS server at 8888. Does that mean anything when I want to really look for traffic to 8888? Not really. Hence, schema on read and write. It's the power of parsing, right? But we're here to talk about enrichment. I love endpoint data. Again, right? All of my Linux boxes, they all run Audit D. I like to know who runs something. I like to know when they did it. I want to know if they're a root user. I want to know if they read certain files. During incident response, how important is it for you to know this user accessed this file at this time, and then this network connection happened? Right? I mean, that's good to know. That's endpoint telemetry. So let's go back to that Audit D log, right? I said, Audit D, you have space in a command. You get this nice hash. Who reads hex natively? Yeah, I don't either. And I'm lazy. I don't want to go out somewhere and convert it. So what did I do? In logstash, I say, hey, give me my data over here. And then I have a cluster of logstash boxes over here. They go through, they run filters, and they send it on to Elastic. Now, because this can go with anything, you can do this with NiFi, however Apache wants it pronounced. I do it with logstash. You can write out to CSV, you can write out to JSON, write out whatever you want to. You can have a Splunk forwarder pick it up, away you go. Doesn't matter what the SIEM is, just nice to be able to front it to be able to do some of this. But I have a filter that says, hey, if I see that, let me use a little bit of Ruby, and look, I don't write Ruby, okay? This is Stack Overflow. This is not me. I have since found out there's a better way to do this, but this was 2 weeks ago, so my apologies. But I use a variant of this, and I still do that with all of my Audit D logs, right? And so this lets me sit down and say, hey, take that hex, convert it back into something I can read. There we go. So now that top line that says ASCII CMD, now I can sit down and say, hey, show me everything where QRadar ran, right? Is that more useful than having to remember, oh yeah, this is the hash, or not the hash, but this is the hex value for user being QRadar? At 3 in the morning, it is for me. We've talked a lot about DNS, right? I sent something out on Twitter last night that said DNS logging was born in 1518 in the village of Glenfinnan on the shores of Loch Shiel. Thank you. I'm so glad there are Highlander fans in here that get that. Okay, if I could only have one log, it would be DNS. Okay, I want to know when new domains are created. I want to know if somebody in my domain is looking up certain country codes. I want to know if somebody from outside of my institution is looking up, I don't know, foo123 dot my university. Those are interesting to me. So we're going to start with a pretend DNS log. Not even a good DNS log, right? We just have the word query and value of protectedstack.net, right? So we're going to start with this. Why? Because this is something that works for DNS, works for HTTP, works for FTP. If you have a host name, this works. Doesn't matter what it is. This is a very simple logstash config. This says, I want to be able to type something in. If I just hit the enter key over and over and over, I want to drop it. And then I want to send it out to my display. And I want it to be pretty. Right? I don't want to see everything kind of jumbled together. Right? So this is our basis. If you're playing Net Wars, this is the simplest Elasticsearch, or I'm sorry, the simplest logstash config that you can have that will work. So when I start up with that, and I say, here is my JSON object of protectedstack.net, I get a nice little message, and it says, oh yeah, your query is protectedstack.net. That's not very useful, right? I mean, that's okay, I guess. I can search for that, but it doesn't really do anything for me. So I want to parse that out. So now I'm going to modify, and I'm going to say, okay, I want to read in from my keyboard, but I'm going to read in JSON. Okay, small change. Now I give it my object, and it says, oh, I have a field of query, and it has a value of protectedstack.net. Is that more useful to me? Is it more useful for me to say, I only want to look for query protected stack versus protected stack and have it churn and churn and churn, reading all my data for stuff that may not have a query field? It's useful for me. Now, as we do enrichment, as we do parsing, that's going to take time. How much time? Well, I don't know. I was curious. So the next thing I wanted to add in was a timer. I said, okay, when you get data over here, add a timestamp. Do what you're going to do. And then just before you spit it out, add another timestamp. Take the difference of the two. Tell me how long it took to process. Is that useful from a SOC perspective? Maybe. Is it good to know, let's say you have Kafka in the middle, and you want to know when did my thing get received versus how long did it spend in Kafka versus when did it finally go out to my SIEM. From a troubleshooting perspective, that's useful for me. From an engineering and architecture perspective, it's useful for me. I add that into my base config. I say, give me protectedstack.net. And it says, okay, cool. I have a P start value, 1:37 a.m. I have a stop value, 1:37 a.m. And it took me 0.0 seconds to process. Great, good baseline. Now, we have a query. Is it useful to know if that was a .net or a .co.uk or a .com? Is it useful to know that protected stack is 14 characters, right? Average domain length is between 8 and 15 characters. Funny how that works out with passwords. But is it useful to know if I have a domain request that's 55 characters long? It's worth it for me. But I don't want to have to sit down and say, oh, well, let's manually chop off the .com or manually chop off the co.uk or, so we're going to use the TLD plugin for logstash. We're going to say, if this query exists or this host name exists, if I have that field, then use the TLD plugin and let's do a lookup on it. Or I'm sorry, let's break it out. So it's going to add in some stuff into an array, And that mutate section in the middle, really, that's just me renaming some stuff, right? I'm going to take this thing that it's creating on the left, and I'm renaming it to something I like to use on the right. If you're playing Net Wars, if you take 555, if you start using Security Onion, what I have as domain registered, you will see as highest registered domain. Okay. So now I give it my protected stack.net query, and now we have something more interesting. We say, oh, okay, that domain's second level. If that is your organization, and you do, let's say you have a .com and a .net and a .org, and you have, maybe you have the .us version of your domain, and now you want to do fuzzy matching on the name itself. Is this beneficial? It is for me. If I'm looking at PR1 ECTED stack, well, that's interesting, right? That's alertable. That's actionable. If I want to know, hey, where are my users going to for foo.com, but not just the .coms, anything that's foo, right? Instead of having to write a query for it and have logic built in, is it easier for me to tell my analysts, hey, give me all the top-level domains for this one name? It's useful for me. Maybe it's useful for you. Like I said, I'm right about twice a day, if I'm lucky. So let's keep going. Mark Baggett's domain stats. I love it. I was introduced to it in 555. It's awesome. It adds a little bit of time to processing, okay? And that little bit of time can be the difference between 8,000 events per second and 800 events per second. Guess how I found this out? So, let's go a little further. I say, if I have a query or if I have a host name, or let me use the REST plugin and do a query against domain stats. Give me the time that domain was created and stick it in domain create date. Notice how I'm using the naming convention domain underscore something, okay? That's because when I look at it in Kibana, you get this nice little alphabetical list of your fields, and I like to have things grouped. I'm weird that way. Now, all I'm giving it is query protected stack.net. But what do I know? Well, now I know that it took me about 3 seconds to process this, right? It's that top line, pipeline stop diff. I know that it's a .NET domain. I know the overall length is 18 characters. This can be useful, right? Say I want an alert on anything that's not Spotify, but that's not Spotify or Amazon, but is over 50 characters, right? That can be useful. I have some information about my pipeline time. Right? This is okay for me. I'm good with that. Notice the second line, caching who is record. Okay, the first time I looked this up, 3 seconds to process. Domain stats caches the results. Next time to process this would be minimal. Caching is your friend. Caching is my friend anyway. Now, I'm a sec guy. My rule of thumb is touch not the unclean thing. If I have a domain come in, I'm not generally going to advocate for my analysts to go out and do a lookup on the domain name, okay? Yes, I'm in higher ed. No, we don't typically have sophisticated attackers, but we do have attackers that are smart enough to say, you know what, this is my domain and I run the DNS server and I'm monitoring who's going out and touching that thing. Okay. We have seen phishing sites go down not when someone went there, but when another machine looks up the domain name. That was a trip. So, that aside, maybe it's useful for you to know, okay, this thing came in at 1:30 a.m., and within about 5 seconds, let's see what it looked up to. Okay, so we're going to use the DNS plugin. And we're going to say, take my query field and resolve it. If you have an IP address, you can do reverse resolution, right? You can do the PTR lookup. Take what I get back, stick it in this domain resolved field. Right? So now I can say, okay, what's the IP address? I've got to stop hitting the wrong button. I keep hitting the laser button. So now I say, hey, give me protectedstack.net. And it says, oh, well, that's at 162.255.119.123. Now I have an IP address. How many of your analysts, how many of you, when you get an IP address, the first thing you do is you say, what's the ASN for that? What company has that, right? How many of you do whois lookup on, or whois lookups on IP addresses, right? I do this over and over and over. That's why I like to automate this. Right, so our next step is to do GeoIP resolution. If I have a domain resolved field, now in production I would do this for any IP address field that I have. But for the demo, we have a domain resolved field, so now we're going to say, if this thing exists, let's use the GeoIP function. We're going to do it twice. We're going to do it once to get city, state, country, that sort of information, and to get the latitude and longitude. Then we're going to do it again to get the AS number and the AS org. Now this is what we have. We started, remember, we're starting with one thing, a domain name, protectedstack.net. Now we know, okay, it took me about 3 seconds for this to move through my pipeline. We have an IP address for it. We know that it's, that at the time, right, because this happened within about let's say it happened within a couple of seconds of when this would have shown up in my log. We know that at the time, it was probably an IP address associated with Namecheap, and MaxMind, the database that it uses by default, thinks that that's probably LA. Now, at 3 a.m. when you've been up for 24 hours, and you're in the middle of an investigation, by the way, don't go for 24 hours straight, right? Get some sleep. But let's say it is 3 a.m. and you have been up for 24 hours. Is it useful for you to be able to take a domain name and then have this work done for you? That's not a rhetorical question. I'm really curious, yes or no. Is that a good thing? It is for me. Okay. The things I do over and over and over, right? I do whois. I do NS lookups. I do more whois. Say, let me jot all this down in my case notes, right? If I have passive DNS from Bro, right? I may, instead of doing a DNS lookup, I may use the Elasticsearch filter, or I may use the MySQL or the JDBC filter, and I would say, hey, what did Bro say the IP address was? Or say the IP addresses were? Maybe it's a CNAME, right? What did that look up to? So my point, and the reason that I argue so heavily to front systems with schema on write methods, right? Doesn't have to be logstash, right? It could be something else. But the reason I like to front those things is because there's work that I do over and over and over. And I don't want to do that by hand every time. When I pass an event off to an analyst, when I give my help desk access to this, right? I don't want them to have to sit down and say, well, who owns that domain? Why are they going there? I want them to be able to look at a log item. I want them to be able to say, oh, I had this query of protectedstack.net, and I want them to be able to see it's this IP address, it's this hosting provider, maybe it's Amazon, okay? Maybe the source of this lookup is a high-value target in my HR department, or because I'm in higher ed, my student accounts department, right? Maybe the destination is not Los Angeles. Maybe it's, I don't know, Moscow. Maybe it's my favorite bulletproof hosting center in the Netherlands, where it feels like everything for a particular virus family is based out of. Is that interesting to know that something in HR is going out and chatting over here? It is for me. It saves me time, saves my analyst time, saves my help desk time. And it took me, 20 minutes maybe to write the filters up. Right? The entire logstash config to do this took me 15, 20 minutes to write out. That's useful.